The tow truck headlights cast long shadows across our driveway as I stood there in my bathrobe, barefoot on the cold concrete. My wife gripped my arm, tears streaming down her face. "You cannot take our car," I shouted over the mechanical whine. "This is private property." Sheriff Sheila stepped between us, hand resting on her holster. Her face showed no emotion, just cold authority beneath the brim of her department-issued hat. "Step back now, or I will have you detained for interfering with an officer." My wife squeezed my arm tighter. Our neighbors peered through curtains. The humiliation burned worse than the anger. "We have the registration right here," I pleaded, waving the paper. "Look at the date." She turned away, deliberately ignoring the proof in my hand. The operator continued winching our car, the one we had worked 2 jobs to afford, onto the flatbed. "This is not legal," I called after her as she walked to her cruiser. She paused, turned back with the faintest smile. "Legal is whatever I say it is in this county." That was the moment I decided Sheriff Sheila had towed her last innocent vehicle. She had just started a war she never saw coming. My mornings followed the same peaceful rhythm for years. Up at 6, coffee brewing by 6:15, newspaper retrieved from the porch by 6:30. Our suburban neighborhood on Maple Street was the picture of quiet American life. Mature oak trees, well-kept lawns, and neighbors who actually knew each other's names. That particular Tuesday began like any other. The April sun streamed through kitchen windows as I poured my first cup of coffee. I kissed Sarah goodbye as she finished her breakfast. My wife of 12 years worked as a hospital administrator downtown, her schedule reliable as clockwork. "Do not forget we have dinner with the Millers tonight," she reminded me, gathering her things for work. "I will put it on my calendar right now," I promised, watching her check her reflection one last time in the hallway mirror. Sarah loved her car more than most people love their pets. The red sedan was not particularly new or fancy, a 2015 Toyota Camry, but it represented something important to us. We had saved for 3 years, working extra shifts and cutting luxuries to afford it without drowning in debt. She kept it immaculate, washed it every weekend, and never ate inside it. The car sat in our paved driveway each night, never on the street. "Have a good day," I called as she headed for the door with her travel mug. I settled into my favorite porch chair with my second cup, preparing to enjoy 30 minutes of reading before starting my own workday from my home office. The neighborhood was quiet except for distant lawnmowers and birds announcing spring's arrival. The harsh mechanical grinding sound shattered that peace like glass breaking. It was loud, industrial, and completely out of place on our residential street. I stood, setting down my book, trying to identify the source. The grinding grew louder, accompanied by the heavy rumble of a large diesel engine. Something was happening at the end of our driveway. "What in the world?" I muttered, stepping off the porch. The scene that greeted me stopped me cold. A massive white tow truck with County Impound painted on its door was backing into position. Behind it sat a county sheriff's cruiser, lights flashing silently. A uniformed figure stood with arms crossed, supervising the operation. Sheriff Sheila Harmon. Everyone in town knew her, not for community outreach or public service, but for her rigid enforcement of every minor ordinance in the county code. The tow operator was already hooking chains to Sarah's Toyota. My confusion quickly transformed into alarm. "Excuse me," I called, walking quickly down the driveway. "What is happening here?" Sheriff Sheila turned, her expression unchanged. Her eyes were hidden behind reflective sunglasses despite the early hour. Her uniform was pressed to military precision, not a wrinkle or smudge anywhere. Vehicle is being impounded, she stated flatly. There must be some mistake, I said, gesturing toward the car. That is my wife's car. She has owned it for years. It is parked in our private driveway. Sheriff Sheila pulled out a small electronic tablet. Registration flagged in the system. Improper registration. My heart hammered against my ribs. That is impossible. We renewed the registration 2 weeks ago. I have the receipt inside. Sir, please step back from the vehicle. This is official county business. The tow operator continued working, completely ignoring our conversation. The mechanical whine grew louder as the winch began pulling the car toward the flatbed. Wait, I protested, raising my voice. You cannot just take our car without warning. This is our property. Sir, Sheriff Sheila said, her voice carrying a warning tone, I need you to step back now. I heard our front door open behind me. Sarah emerged, purse still over her shoulder, witnessing the scene with growing horror. Mark, what is happening to my car? Her voice cracked slightly. And that was the moment everything normal about our quiet suburban life shattered completely. I ran back into the house, nearly tripping over the welcome mat in my haste. Our important documents lived in a fire-safe box in the office closet. My hands trembled slightly as I entered the combination and retrieved the folder labeled Vehicles. Outside, I could hear Sarah's voice, confused and increasingly distressed. Sheriff Sheila's responses were too quiet to make out, but her tone remained coldly official. The registration receipt was exactly where I remembered filing it, dated exactly 15 days ago. The confirmation number was clearly printed, along with the validation stamp from the DMV website. We had paid for a full year, renewed early as we always did. I rushed back outside, document in hand. Sarah stood frozen on the lawn, watching helplessly as the tow operator secured the final chains around her car's rear axle. Here, I said breathlessly, extending the paper toward Sheriff Sheila. The registration was renewed 2 weeks ago. Here is the receipt with confirmation number. Sheriff Sheila glanced at the paper without taking it. Her eyes moved across it for barely a second before looking back at me. That is not what my system says, she stated. But this is the official receipt, I insisted, pushing it closer. Call the DMV. They will confirm everything is current. There must be a lag in your system. Sheriff Sheila shook her head once. My tablet shows the registration expired. Vehicle is being impounded according to county ordinance. Sarah stepped forward, her professional composure cracking. Please, I need my car for work. Can we resolve this another way? We can go to the DMV right now. You can appeal at the county office, Sheriff Sheila replied mechanically. Retrieval fee is $300 plus $50 per day storage. Paperwork will be available at the impound lot. The hydraulic lift of the tow truck whined loudly as it raised my wife's car off the ground. The Toyota hung suspended, looking somehow vulnerable and small. This is completely unreasonable, I said, my voice rising. You have proof right in front of you that the registration is valid. Sheriff Sheila turned away from me, speaking into her radio. Unit 14 completing impound at 427 Maple Street. Clear for next call. The tow operator climbed into his cab, never having spoken a single word during the entire encounter. The engine roared as he prepared to drive away. Sarah suddenly found her voice. Mark, do something. The desperation in her tone cut through me like a knife. You need to provide us with documentation, I called after Sheriff Sheila, who was walking back to her cruiser. You need to give us something in writing explaining why you are taking our car. She paused, turned back, Paperwork will be at the impound office." Her voice carried no emotion, no hint of recognition that she was disrupting our lives. We stood helplessly in our driveway as both vehicles pulled away, the tow truck with Sarah's car chained to its bed, followed by Sheriff Sheila's cruiser. Our neighbors watched from windows and porches, the spectacle providing morning entertainment at our expense. Sarah collapsed onto the front step, tears welling in her eyes. "What just happened? How can she just take our car?" I sat beside her, arm around her shoulders. "I do not know, but this is not right." For the next 3 hours, I made calls. First to the sheriff's department, where a disinterested dispatcher informed me that Sheriff Sheila was following standard procedure and referred me to the impound lot. The impound lot clerk claimed they could not release the vehicle without clearance from the sheriff's office. The DMV confirmed our registration was active and current in their system. Each call ended the same way, with me being told to speak to someone else who could not or would not help. Sarah called her work to explain she would be late. The shame in her voice as she described the situation made my blood boil. This was more than an inconvenience. It was a humiliation, a powerless feeling that someone with authority could simply take what belonged to us without justification. "They must have made a mistake," Sarah said quietly as we sat at the kitchen table, the morning now completely derailed. "This was not a mistake," I replied, a certainty growing inside me. "This was deliberate." That afternoon, I drove Sarah to work in my truck, her eyes still red from crying. I promised her I would get the car back. What I did not tell her was the suspicion forming in my mind, that Sheriff Sheila had targeted us specifically, and that this might be just the beginning. The county impound lot sat at the edge of town, a fenced gravel yard filled with vehicles in various states of abandonment. A small trailer served as an office, with peeling paint and barred windows that suggested the county budget prioritized other departments. I paid the $300 processing fee in cash, gritting my teeth at the injustice of paying to retrieve what was wrongfully taken. The clerk, a heavy-set man named Billy with grease-stained coveralls, counted the money twice before sliding me a clipboard with release forms. "Registration problem, huh?" he asked, not looking up from the cash drawer. "There was no registration problem," I replied, filling out the forms. "We renewed 2 weeks ago." I showed Sheriff Sheila the receipt. Billy paused, glancing up at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Sheriff Sheila brought this one in herself." Something in his tone caught my attention. "She supervised the tow from our driveway this morning. Why?" He hesitated, looking around the empty office before leaning forward slightly. "No reason, just asking." I set my pen down. Has this happened before? Cars towed for registration issues that turn out not to be issues at all. Billy straightened up, his face closing off. "I just processed the paperwork, mister. Your car is in row 3, space 8. Keys are in the ignition." As he turned away, I pressed further. "How many cars does Sheriff Sheila bring in each month?" "Cannot discuss county business," he muttered, suddenly busy with filing. I collected the keys and walked through the lot toward Sarah's car. The red Toyota sat forlornly between a rusted pickup truck and an abandoned minivan. As I approached, I noticed a man in mechanic's coveralls inspecting a vehicle several spaces away. "Excuse me," I called out, "do you work here?" The man glanced up, wiping his hands on a rag. "Jake Miller, head mechanic." He gestured toward the Toyota. "That your car?" "My wife's. It was towed this morning for a registration issue that does not exist." Jake nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Let me guess, Sheriff Sheila." My heart rate quickened. "Yes, how did you know?" He looked around cautiously before answering. "You are not the first, not by a long shot." "What do you mean?" Jake sighed, tucking the rag into his back pocket. "Look, I just fix engines, but I see the paperwork. Sheriff brings in 2, 3 cars a week, always something minor, registration, parking violations, suspected equipment failures that magically disappear once the car is here." "That cannot be legal," I said, my suspicions confirming themselves in real time. "Maybe not, but who is going to stop her?" Jake shrugged. "She is the sheriff. People pay the fees because fighting it costs more than giving in." I drove Sarah's car home, my mind racing with this new information. If Sheriff Sheila had done this to others, there was a pattern, possibly a long-standing abuse of power that had gone unchallenged. That evening, after picking Sarah up from work, I shared what Jake had told me. Instead of relief that we were not singled out, her expression hardened. "This makes it worse," she said quietly. "She is deliberately hurting people because she knows she can get away with it." The next day, I began asking questions around town. Our neighbor Ellen mentioned that her son's motorcycle had been impounded last summer for excessive noise, despite having a legal muffler. The Morrison family 3 streets over had their RV towed from their own backyard for improper storage, a citation that cost them nearly $500 to resolve. Each story followed the same pattern. Sheriff Sheila appeared personally, cited an ordinance or regulation, ignored any evidence contradicting her claim, and left citizens with no immediate recourse. By the end of the week, I had compiled a list of 12 similar incidents within our neighborhood alone. Some people spoke freely, others were hesitant, fearful of retaliation if Sheriff Sheila discovered they had complained. The most revealing conversation came from Eleanor Johnson, a 3rd-grade teacher at the local elementary school. "She had my Honda towed from the teacher's parking lot," Eleanor told me over coffee at the local diner. "Claimed I was parked in a loading zone. There were no signs, no yellow curb, nothing. When I showed up at the impound lot, they had a picture of my car parked next to a temporary sign that I swear was not there when I parked." "Did you fight it?" I asked. Eleanor laughed bitterly. "On a teacher's salary, the appeal process alone would have cost more than the fees. Plus, you know how small towns work. Her cousin is on the county commission. Her brother-in-law works at the courthouse. The whole system protects her." I added Eleanor's story to my growing file, complete with dates, locations, and the specific ordinances Sheriff Sheila had cited in each case. The pattern was unmistakable. She targeted people who were unlikely or unable to fight back through official channels. That night, Sarah sat beside me at the kitchen table, reviewing the evidence I had gathered. "What are you going to do with all this?" she asked, her voice both concerned and encouraging. I looked up from my notes, a determination settling over me. Something she is not expecting. I am going to fight back, not just for us, but for everyone she has pushed around. For the first time since the towing incident, Sarah smiled. "Good, because what she is doing is wrong and somebody needs to stand up to her." I had no idea then how personally Sheriff Sheila would take my interference, or how quickly she would escalate our conflict from a matter of principle into a personal vendetta. The first sign of retaliation came 3 days after I began collecting statements from Sheriff Sheila's victims. Sarah noticed it first, the distinctive black and white cruiser creeping past our house at exactly 7:45 a.m., moving at perhaps 10 miles per hour. The sheriff did not look toward our house, but her message was clear. "I see you." "Maybe it is just a coincidence," Sarah suggested, though her tone betrayed her disbelief. That afternoon, the cruiser passed again, and again that evening. By the fourth day, the pattern was undeniable. Sheriff Sheila was monitoring our home, making her presence known. I own a small plumbing business, operating primarily from my work van parked in our side driveway. On Friday morning, I found a bright orange citation tucked under the windshield wiper. The violation: commercial vehicle improperly stored in residential zone. The fine was $75. I photographed the citation, then the van, then the driveway, documenting everything. The county ordinance cited on the ticket specified that commercial vehicles over 12,000 pounds were prohibited in residential driveways. My van weighed less than 8,000 pounds fully loaded. "This is ridiculous," Sarah said when I showed her the ticket. "Your van has been parked there for 5 years. Nobody has ever complained." "That is the point," I replied. "She is sending a message." I filed an appeal with the county clerk's office, providing documentation of my van's weight specifications and photographs showing it was properly parked on our private property. The clerk, a thin woman with nervous eyes, accepted my paperwork without comment, though her glance toward the sheriff's office across the street told me everything I needed to know. The escalation continued. Monday morning, a knock at the door revealed a man in a county windbreaker holding a clipboard. "Zoning inspection," he announced without introducing himself. "We have received a complaint about code violations on your property." "What violations?" I asked, blocking the doorway. "Shed placement," he replied, consulting his clipboard. "County ordinance requires all outbuildings to be at least 10 feet from property lines." The wooden shed in our backyard had been there since we bought the house 6 years earlier. It sat approximately 8 feet from our back fence, a fact I had never considered significant until that moment. "May I see the complaint?" I asked. "Complaints are confidential," he responded automatically. "I need to inspect and document the violation." I led him into the backyard, following closely as he measured the distance from shed to fence with a tape measure. He took several photographs, made notes on his form, and handed me a violation notice with a $150 fine. "You have 30 days to move the structure or face additional penalties," he said, avoiding eye contact. As he left, I called after him, "Who authorized this inspection?" He paused briefly at the gate. "The complaint came through the sheriff's office." That evening, I installed security cameras around our property, 2 covering the driveway, 1 aimed at the street, and 1 monitoring the backyard. If Sheriff Sheila wanted to play this game, I would gather evidence of every move she made. Sarah watched me mount the final camera with a worried expression. "Mark, are you sure this is worth it? Maybe we should just pay the fines and let it go." I climbed down from the ladder, wiping sweat from my forehead. If we give in, she wins. And not just against us. She continues thinking she can bully anyone in this town without consequences. Sarah nodded slowly. "I know. I am just worried about how far she might go." Her concern was justified. The next morning, our trash cans had been overturned, garbage scattered across our driveway. The security footage showed a figure in dark clothing at 3:17 a.m., face obscured by a hood, deliberately dumping each bin before disappearing down the street. I could not prove it was Sheriff Sheila or someone acting on her orders, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidence. By the end of the week, we had received 2 more citations, one for excessive lawn height, despite our grass being freshly mowed, and another for a potentially hazardous tree limb overhanging our property. The harassment was systematic, designed to wear us down through constant inconvenience and mounting fines. Sheriff Sheila was sending a clear message. She could make our lives miserable indefinitely, using the very legal system she was supposed to uphold. That Sunday, after another patrol car drove slowly past our house for the sixth time that day, I made a decision. I gathered all my documentation, the statements from other victims, photographs of our citations and security footage showing the pattern of surveillance, and called the number of a civil rights attorney I had researched online. "My name is Mark Thompson," I said when the receptionist answered. "I need to speak with someone about ongoing harassment by our county sheriff." The following afternoon, I sat across from Attorney James Wilson in his modest office 20 miles outside our county lines. As he reviewed my documentation, his expression grew increasingly grave. "What Sheriff Sheila is doing," he said finally, "is not just unethical, it is illegal." Attorney Wilson's office smelled of old books and coffee. The walls were lined with legal volumes, and his cluttered desk suggested a man too busy for organization. He adjusted his reading glasses as he studied the evidence I had compiled. "This is remarkably thorough," he said, leafing through the folder. "Most people do not document harassment this carefully." "I knew from the beginning this was not right," I replied. "I wanted to be prepared." He nodded, pausing at the photographs of Sheriff Sheila's cruiser passing our house repeatedly. "How many separate incidents have you recorded so far?" 23 in just over 2 weeks. The drive-bys, 5 bogus citations, the zoning inspection, and 2 anonymous complaints to the homeowners association that I cannot prove came from her but suspiciously coincided with everything else. Attorney Wilson closed the folder and removed his glasses. "Mr. Thompson, what Sheriff Sheila is doing constitutes official misconduct and harassment under color of authority. These are serious civil rights violations." His words validated what I had suspected, but hearing a legal professional confirm it brought both relief and resolve. "What can we do?" I asked. "Several things," he replied, leaning forward. "First, we file a formal complaint with the State Police Internal Affairs Division. They have oversight authority when local law enforcement is implicated. Second, we petition for injunctive relief to prevent further harassment while the investigation proceeds. Third, we prepare a civil suit for damages." The attorney's confidence was reassuring, but I harbored doubts about challenging someone with Sheriff Sheila's connections. Will any of this actually work? She seems untouchable locally. "That is precisely why we go above her head," Wilson explained. "County sheriffs have authority, but they are not immune to state oversight, and we have something powerful on our side." "What is that?" "Evidence," he said simply. "Most victims of official harassment cannot prove their claims. You have dates, times, photographs, witness statements, and a clear pattern of escalation. That makes all the difference." We spent the next 2 hours drafting formal complaints and requests for investigation. Wilson was particularly interested in the original towing incident. "We need the dash cam footage from her cruiser and any body cam she might have been wearing," he explained. "Law enforcement must retain those recordings for at least 90 days. "Will they release them to us?" "Not voluntarily," Wilson admitted, "but a subpoena from the State Oversight Board will compel production." By the time I left his office, we had set in motion 3 separate legal actions: a formal misconduct complaint filed with the State Police Internal Affairs Division, a records request for all documentation related to the towing of Sarah's vehicle, and a petition for emergency injunctive relief to prevent further harassment. "Be prepared," Wilson warned as I departed. "She will likely escalate when served with these papers. Document everything." His prediction proved accurate sooner than expected. The very next morning, two deputies from Sheriff Sheila's department parked across from our driveway, remaining there for over 3 hours. They made no attempt to be subtle, staring openly at our house and taking notes whenever I appeared outside. I photographed them from behind our curtains, adding the images to my growing file. That afternoon, I received a call from Attorney Wilson. "The State Oversight Board has agreed to review our complaint," he informed me, "and the subpoenas for the towing records and video footage will be served tomorrow." "How long until we see results?" I asked. "The wheels of justice turn slowly," he cautioned, "but they do turn. Expect pushback from the sheriff's department. They will likely claim technical difficulties or lost footage." True to Wilson's prediction, the sheriff's department initially responded that the dash cam had malfunctioned during the towing incident. However, a stern follow-up from the state investigator clarified that such convenient malfunctions would themselves become part of the investigation. 3 days later, the footage arrived at Wilson's office. I sat beside him as he played the video on his computer screen. The recording showed Sheriff Sheila approaching Sarah's car in our driveway. Her body camera captured her running the license plate through her onboard system. Most crucially, it recorded the response: registration, valid and current. She had seen this information, then deliberately proceeded with the tow anyway. Even more damning was what happened next. As I approached with the registration receipt in the video, Sheriff Sheila clearly looked at the document, then turned away, ordering the tow to continue despite having verification that the registration was valid. "This is textbook abuse of authority," Wilson said, pausing the footage. She knowingly proceeded with an unlawful seizure of property after being presented with contradictory evidence. We also obtained the complete towing report through our records request. Half the required fields were blank or contained clearly falsified information. The stated reason for impoundment had been changed from registration violation to obstructing county right-of-way, a completely different justification that still made no sense for a car parked in a private driveway. "The inconsistencies in the paperwork strengthen our case considerably," Wilson noted. She changed her story when she realized the original justification was demonstrably false. Our evidence package was growing stronger by the day. The state investigation was moving forward, statements were being taken from other victims, and the pattern of Sheriff Sheila's misconduct was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Then came an unexpected development. A reporter from the local newspaper called me, requesting an interview about the allegations against Sheriff Harmon. Someone had leaked information about the state investigation. After consulting with Wilson, I agreed to speak on the record, providing copies of the non-confidential portions of our evidence. 3 days later, the story ran on the front page: "Sheriff accused of systematic harassment and abuse of power." The article detailed multiple incidents of questionable vehicle seizures, selective enforcement, and apparent retaliation against citizens who challenged Sheriff Sheila's authority. It mentioned our case specifically, including the dash cam evidence showing she had knowingly towed a properly registered vehicle. The public revelation transformed our private legal battle into a community issue. Sheriff Sheila called an emergency press conference the same afternoon, standing before cameras with a defiant expression. "These allegations are completely unfounded," she declared, her voice steady but her eyes betraying anger. "My department enforces the law equally and fairly for all citizens. This is nothing more than a personal vendetta from individuals who believe they are above the rules that keep our community safe." Her denial might have been convincing to someone who had not seen the evidence. But the video footage did not lie, and more victims were now coming forward daily, encouraged by the newspaper coverage. Attorney Wilson called that evening, his voice animated with excitement. The State Oversight Board has scheduled an emergency hearing. They are taking this seriously, Mark. Very seriously indeed. For the first time since this ordeal began, I allowed myself to believe that Sheriff Sheila might actually face consequences for her actions. The system that had enabled her abuse of power was finally being forced to confront it. What I did not yet realize was how quickly public sentiment would turn against her once the full extent of her misconduct became known. I never expected to become the center of a town uprising, but that is exactly what happened. The morning after the local paper ran the story about Sheila's improper towing practices, my phone would not stop ringing. First came Mrs. Peterson, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and relief. "I saw your story in the paper," she said. "Last winter, Sheila had my car towed while I was at church. She claimed it was parked illegally on a snow route, but it was in the church parking lot. When I tried to complain, nobody would listen." Then came Marcus from the hardware store. "3 months ago, my delivery truck disappeared from behind my own shop. Sheila said it violated commercial vehicle ordinances. Cost me $400 and a day of business to get it back." The calls kept coming. By noon, I had filled an entire notebook with stories, each one another piece of Sheila's towing empire. Elderly residents whose medical transport vehicles disappeared. Single mothers finding empty driveways after work. Restaurant owners whose customer parking had been systematically emptied during dinner rushes. All of them had one thing in common: they had crossed Sheila in some minor way. That evening, my wife and I attended a hastily organized community meeting at the library. The room was designed to hold 50 people. Over 100 showed up, standing along the walls, sitting on windowsills. When my wife and I walked in, the chatter quieted momentarily. Then someone started to clap. Others joined. It was surreal. Marcus stood up at the front of the room, holding a clipboard with pages of signatures. "We are officially calling for Sheriff Sheila's immediate suspension pending investigation," he announced. "So far, we have collected 352 signatures. By tomorrow, we expect to have over 500. The sheriff's department was already scrambling. They issued a press release that morning, carefully crafted to distance themselves from Sheila's actions. "The department takes these allegations seriously," it read. "The actions described do not represent our department's policies or values. We are conducting an internal review of all towing procedures." But nobody was buying it. Too many of them had called that same department for help after their vehicles disappeared, only to be ignored or dismissed. 3 days after the story broke, Sheila finally emerged. She called a press conference on the steps of the municipal building. I stood in the crowd, my lawyer beside me, as she approached the microphone. She looked different, smaller somehow, without the shield of her authority to hide behind. "I wish to address the recent allegations regarding vehicle removal procedures," she began, reading stiffly from a prepared statement. "There appears to have been a series of unfortunate miscommunications between my office and residents. I want to assure everyone that at no point was there any intentional wrongdoing." A reporter from the local television station raised his hand. "Sheriff, are you denying that you ordered cars towed without proper documentation or cause?" Sheila's face tightened. "I am saying that in the course of maintaining public safety and order, sometimes administrative errors occur. My office has always acted in good faith." Another voice called out, What about retaliating against citizens who questioned you? She refused to answer directly, pivoting back to her prepared statement. But the damage was done. Nobody believed her. The crowd's energy had shifted from curiosity to anger. That evening, the town council announced an emergency public inquiry. The notice was posted on the town website. Due to the volume and severity of allegations regarding improper towing practices, the council will hold a special public hearing next Tuesday at 6 p.m. This was no longer just my fight against one corrupt officer. This had become the town reclaiming its dignity from years of quiet abuse. I never thought this would get so big. My wife whispered that night as we lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Neither did I admitted. But maybe it needed to. Maybe we all needed to finally say enough. She reached for my hand in the darkness. Are you ready for Tuesday to speak in front of everyone? I squeezed her fingers. I have been ready since the moment I watched them tow your car away. The town hall had never been so packed. People lined the walls and spilled out into the hallway. The air conditioning struggled against the combined heat of hundreds of bodies pressed together in anticipation. At the front of the room sat the 7 members of the town council behind their elevated desk, looking both nervous and determined. Mayor Wilson opened the proceedings with a solemn statement about the responsibilities of public service. The authority we grant to our law enforcement officials comes with the expectation of fairness, transparency, and adherence to procedure, he said. Tonight, we will hear testimony regarding alleged breaches of that trust. I sat in the front row beside my lawyer, a folder of documents and a USB drive containing all our video evidence resting in my lap. My wife sat beside me, her face a complex mixture of anxiety and resolve. Across the aisle, Sheila sat with 2 attorneys from the county, her face carefully arranged into an expression of professional concern. When they called my name, I approached the podium. The microphone picked up my heartbeat for a moment before I began speaking. 3 weeks ago, Sheriff Sheila Martinez ordered the towing of my wife's vehicle from our private driveway. I began, my voice steadier than I expected. The vehicle was legally registered. The registration had been renewed 2 weeks prior. I provided proof of this registration at the time of the incident. I pulled out my phone and connected it to the projector. The video from our security camera played on the wall behind the council. It showed Sheila standing in our driveway, looking at the paperwork in my hand, then deliberately turning away and signaling to the tow operator. As you can see, Sheriff Martinez was presented with valid registration documentation and chose to ignore it, I continued. Furthermore, she did this without a warrant, without notice, and without any legal justification. I played the next clip, showing Sheila's patrol car driving slowly past our house multiple times over the following days. After I filed a complaint, Sheriff Martinez began what I can only describe as a campaign of intimidation. By the time I finished presenting our evidence, including the improper citations and zoning violations that followed, the room had fallen into a stunned silence. Mayor Wilson asked if my wife wished to speak. She stood and moved to the podium. Her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone. I have lived in this town my entire life, she began, her voice quiet but clear. I have always believed in our community and our institutions. What happened to us was not just about a car. It was about power and control. It was about someone with authority deciding they could violate our property and our dignity without consequence. Her voice caught, but she steadied herself. The day my car was towed, I lost more than transportation. I lost my sense of security in my own home. I lost faith in the system I had always trusted. But worst of all, she paused, looking directly at Sheila, I lost respect for a badge that should represent protection, not persecution. When she returned to her seat, I held her hand tightly. Her testimony had shifted the energy in the room. Then the flood began. Marcus from the hardware store described how his delivery truck was towed during his busiest season. Mrs. Peterson recounted missing a doctor's appointment when her car disappeared. A young veteran named James described how Sheila had his motorcycle towed while he was deployed overseas. The most devastating testimony came from Elena Rodriguez, a single mother of 3. My car was taken the morning of my son's emergency surgery, Elena said, tears streaming down her face. I had to call an ambulance to take us to the hospital. When I tried to explain the situation to Sheriff Martinez, she told me that personal problems do not exempt anyone from the law. My son was 5 years old and needed emergency appendix surgery. After 4 hours of testimony, Sheila finally took the stand. Her attorney tried to frame the incidents as administrative oversights rather than abuses of power. Sheriff Martinez has served this community for 15 years, her attorney argued. These isolated incidents must be viewed in the context of an otherwise exemplary career. When questioned directly about the evidence, Sheila's explanations began to unravel. If the registration was valid, why did you order the tow? Asked Councilwoman Hayes. My system showed it was expired, Sheila replied. And when presented with proof that the system was incorrect, I needed to verify the document's authenticity. By towing the vehicle first, Councilwoman Hayes pressed. Standard procedure when documentation is in question, Sheila insisted. Can you point to that procedure in the department manual? The councilwoman asked. Sheila could not. As the questioning continued, Sheila's answers became increasingly contradictory. She denied targeting specific individuals, yet could not explain why the same towing company was used for every removal. She claimed to have received complaints about the vehicles, yet could provide no record of those complaints. Finally, after nearly 6 hours of testimony, Mayor Wilson called for a vote. Given the evidence presented here tonight, I move that we authorize a complete audit of all towing actions taken by the Sheriff's Department over the past 2 years, and that Sheriff Martinez be placed on administrative leave pending the results of this audit. The vote was unanimous. As the gavel struck, finalizing the decision, a collective exhale moved through the room. It was not victory, not yet, but it was the beginning of accountability. As we filed out of the hall, my lawyer leaned over. That went better than we could have hoped. The audit will reveal everything. How long will it take? I asked. They will move quickly now, he said. Too much public pressure not to. That night as we drove home, my wife suddenly began to cry. What is wrong? I asked, alarmed. Nothing, she said, wiping her eyes. For the first time since this all started, these are not tears of frustration. They are tears of relief. The audit took 3 weeks, 3 weeks of nervous waiting, of questions and rumors swirling through town. The independent auditors worked day and night, requesting records from the sheriff's department, the county clerk, and the local towing companies. They interviewed deputies, administrative staff, and dozens of affected citizens. When the results finally came, they exploded through our community like a thunderclap. The town council called a special session to present the findings. This time, the meeting was held in the high school gymnasium to accommodate the crowd. My wife and I arrived early, yet still barely found seats. Mayor Wilson approached the microphone, looking grave. The independent audit of our sheriff department's towing practices has been completed, he began. I must inform you that the findings are deeply troubling and far more extensive than initially suspected. He adjusted his glasses and read directly from the report. The audit identified 42 cases of improper vehicle removal over the past 24 months. In 36 of these cases, vehicles were towed without proper documentation or legal cause. In 28 cases, owners were charged impound fees without court approval. In 17 cases, vehicles were seized from private property without warrants. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Furthermore, the mayor continued, the audit revealed that in all 42 cases, a single towing company was used exclusively, Valley Towing and Recovery, owned by Michael Martinez, Sheriff Sheila Martinez's first cousin. The murmur became a roar. I looked at my wife, whose hand had flown to her mouth in shock. Financial records indicate that Valley Towing has paid consulting fees totaling approximately $37,000 to a private LLC registered to Sheriff Martinez over this same period. The mayor had to pause as the crowd erupted. When order was finally restored, he delivered the final blow. Based on these findings, Sheriff Martinez has been placed on unpaid administrative leave effective immediately. The district attorney's office has been provided with all evidence and has opened a criminal investigation into possible misconduct, abuse of authority, and financial fraud. I sat stunned. The scope of corruption was far greater than any of us had imagined. This was not just about petty revenge or power trips. This was systematic exploitation for financial gain. As we left the gymnasium, reporters surrounded us. A young woman from the local news thrust a microphone toward me. As the person who first brought these abuses to light, what is your reaction to the audit's findings? I paused, gathering my thoughts. This was never about one car or one incident. This was about abuse of power that affected our entire community. The audit confirmed what many suspected but few could prove, that those entrusted with upholding the law were using it as a weapon for personal gain. That evening, we watched the news from our living room. The story had gone beyond our local station. Regional networks were now covering it. The camera showed Sheriff Sheila being escorted from the department building, no longer in uniform, carrying a box of personal items. "How are you feeling?" my wife asked. "I do not know," I admitted. Vindicated, but also sad. Sad that someone with so much responsibility could betray public trust so completely. The next day, Sheila's attorney released a statement claiming she had been unaware of her cousin's business dealings, and that any payments were for legitimate consultancy work unrelated to her official duties. Nobody believed it. 3 days after the audit's release, I received a call from my lawyer. "The DA just announced the charges," he said, his voice tense with excitement. "Multiple counts of abuse of authority, fraud, accepting kickbacks, conspiracy to defraud the public, and misuse of public resources." "Will it go to trial?" I asked. Her attorney is desperately trying to negotiate a plea deal, but the DA is playing hardball. There is too much public pressure now. They want to make an example of her. A week later, the sheriff's department issued a formal public apology. The interim sheriff, a 30-year veteran named David Reynolds, stood before the cameras looking both solemn and determined. "On behalf of the department, I want to extend our deepest apologies to all community members affected by these inexcusable actions," he said. "We are implementing immediate reforms, including a complete overhaul of our vehicle removal policies, independent oversight of all towing operations, and mandatory recording of all enforcement actions." He went on to announce that the department would be providing full restitution to all affected parties, including towing costs, impound fees, and compensation for related hardships. Then came the moment that truly marked the end of Sheila's reign. Without warning or public announcement, she resigned. No press conference, no statement of contrition, just a letter delivered to the county commissioners and a badge turned in at the front desk. The following day, I received an official letter in the mail. My civil complaint had been fully upheld. The department acknowledged the violation of our rights and enclosed a check covering not just the towing costs, but additional compensation for the harassment and emotional distress we had endured. It was over. Sheriff Sheila's towing empire had collapsed, and our community could begin to heal. The criminal case against Sheila moved faster than anyone anticipated. With the overwhelming evidence from the audit and the growing testimony from affected citizens, the district attorney pushed for swift justice. I sat in the courtroom for the preliminary hearing, watching as Sheila's attorney desperately maneuvered for leniency. My client maintains that she was unaware of any financial impropriety, her lawyer argued. She acknowledges administrative oversights in the towing procedures, but denies any criminal intent. The DA, a sharp-eyed woman named Catherine Reynolds, was unmoved. Your Honor, the evidence demonstrates a clear pattern of deliberate misconduct. Sheriff Martinez did not simply make mistakes. She orchestrated a systematic abuse of authority for personal financial gain. The audit reveals that following each improper tow, funds flowed from her cousin's company to her private LLC. This was not oversight. This was corruption. As the hearing proceeded, I watched Sheila closely. The composed, intimidating figure who had stood in my driveway ordering my wife's car towed was gone. In her place sat a diminished woman in civilian clothes, her shoulders hunched, her eyes fixed on the table before her. The judge denied her attorney's motion to dismiss the most serious charges. The evidence presented is sufficient to proceed on all counts, he ruled. Outside the courthouse, Catherine Reynolds addressed the waiting reporters. My office will pursue this case to the fullest extent of the law, she stated. Public trust was severely violated. When an officer of the law uses their badge as a license for personal enrichment, the damage extends beyond individual victims to the very foundation of community safety and justice. Back at home, I told my wife about the proceedings. Do you think she will serve time? She asked. The DA seems determined, I replied. But even if she doesn't, her career is over. Her reputation is destroyed. The power she abused has been taken away forever. 2 weeks later, we received notice of another town council meeting. This one was to address the systemic issues that had allowed Sheila's abuses to continue unchecked for so long. The council room was packed again, but the atmosphere was different, less angry, more determined and forward-looking. Mayor Wilson called the meeting to order. Tonight, we consider new ordinances designed to prevent similar abuses in the future, he began. The events of recent months have exposed serious gaps in oversight and accountability within our local government. The proposed changes were comprehensive: body cameras for all officers, civilian review of all vehicle impoundments, strict guidelines prohibiting financial relationships between law enforcement and service providers, and a new independent ethics board with real investigative authority. During the public comment period, I approached the microphone. What happened in our town was not just one person's corruption, I said. It was a failure of systems that should protect citizens from abuse of authority. These new measures are not about distrusting law enforcement. They are about creating the transparency that builds true trust. The ordinances passed unanimously. As we left the meeting, several council members approached to thank us for our persistence in bringing the truth to light. Later that week, I received an unexpected visit from Interim Sheriff Reynolds. "I wanted to personally deliver this," he said, handing me an envelope. Inside was a formal letter of apology from the department, along with documents indicating that all records related to our violations had been expunged. "We are also implementing a retraining program for all officers," Reynolds explained. "This situation has been a painful lesson for the entire department." As he turned to leave, he paused. "You know, not many people would have had the courage to stand up the way you did. Most would have paid the fine and tried to forget about it. You changed things, not just for yourselves, but for everyone." The following day, the breaking news alert flashed across my phone. Former Sheriff Pleads guilty in TOWING scandal. Sheila had accepted a plea deal. She would serve no jail time but would face 5 years of probation, substantial financial penalties, and permanent revocation of her law enforcement credentials. More importantly, the plea required her to make a public admission of guilt, a final humiliation for someone who had wielded power so arrogantly. That evening, she appeared briefly before cameras outside the courthouse. Gone was the uniform, the badge, the air of untouchable authority. She read a prepared statement in a flat voice. "I acknowledge that I violated the trust placed in me by this community," she said. "I used my position inappropriately and failed to uphold the standards expected of law enforcement. I accept full responsibility for my actions and apologize to those affected by my misconduct." As I watched her walk away from the microphones, hounded by reporters, I felt an unexpected emotion, not satisfaction or triumph, but a profound sense of closure. The system that had seemed so broken, so tilted against ordinary citizens, had ultimately worked. That night, my wife and I received the last piece of official correspondence in the case, notification that our civil complaint had been completely resolved, with full compensation awarded. The sheriff's department would be paying restitution, not just for the towing costs, but for the harassment and violation of our civil rights. Justice had been slow, but it had been thorough. 1 month after Sheila's guilty plea, my wife's car sat in our driveway, gleaming like never before. We had used part of the settlement to have it fully detailed and serviced. The mechanics had even replaced the axle that had been damaged during the improper towing. "It looks almost brand new," my wife said, running her hand along the freshly waxed hood. "Better than new," I replied. "Now it has a story." We had decided to host a small gathering to thank everyone who had supported us through the ordeal. It was partly celebration, partly community healing. Our driveway and front yard were filled with neighbors, friends, and many of the people who had come forward with their own Sheila stories. Marcus from the hardware store brought folding tables. Mrs. Peterson arrived with her famous apple pie. Elena Rodriguez and her now-recovered son helped set up chairs. It felt like the entire town had squeezed into our modest property. As the evening progressed, Mayor Wilson asked for everyone's attention. He raised a glass of lemonade. "To standing up for what is right," he toasted, "and to neighbors who look out for each other." The cheer that followed was heartfelt. As conversations resumed, I noticed a reporter from the regional newspaper sitting quietly at the edge of the gathering, taking notes. I approached her. "Writing a follow-up story?" I asked. She nodded. "This is the part most news coverage misses, what happens after the headlines fade, how communities heal." I considered this. You know, when this all started, it was just about getting my wife's car back. I never imagined it would expose so much corruption or bring so many people together. That is often how meaningful change happens, she observed. One person refuses to accept an injustice, and it creates a ripple effect. Those ripples continued to spread. With part of our settlement, we had established a small nonprofit organization called Citizen Oversight Project. We offered resources teaching ordinary people how to document official misconduct, file effective complaints, and navigate the often intimidating process of holding authorities accountable. Within weeks, we were receiving inquiries from neighboring towns and even distant counties. Our story had struck a chord that resonated far beyond our community. The most significant change came 3 months after Sheila's plea, when our town unanimously passed what locals now called the driveway law, an ordinance requiring judicial approval before any vehicle could be removed from private property. The law also mandated video documentation of all tows and strict penalties for violations. Similar ordinances were now being considered in towns across the state. What had begun as one corrupt sheriff's abuse of power had sparked a movement for transparency and accountability. On a warm Saturday afternoon, I sat on our porch, watching as my wife washed her car in our driveway. The simple normalcy of the scene struck me, how ordinary it looked, yet how hard won that ordinary moment had been. She noticed me watching and smiled. "What are you thinking about so intensely?" I walked over to her, taking in the peaceful scene. Our house, our yard, our driveway with her car safely parked where it belonged. "I am thinking about how standing up is not weakness. It is the beginning of strength," I said. "I am thinking about how one driveway became the starting point for changing an entire system." She put down the sponge and took my hand, her fingers still damp and soapy. We looked at our modest driveway, now restored to its proper purpose. "The driveway is ours again," she said quietly. "Yes," I agreed, "and so is our town." As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across our property, I reflected on how it all began, with the sound of a tow truck in the early morning, and how it ended, with a community that remembered its own power, a sheriff who lost hers, and a driveway that stood as a symbol of ordinary citizens who refused to be bullied. Sometimes justice starts in the smallest of places. Sometimes it starts right in your own driveway.